Every 8 minutes, a ship the length of 4 football fields slides into a channel carved through the jungle of Panama, and with it, moves roughly $270 billion a year in global trade. Container ships stacked with televisions from South Korea, tankers loaded with liquefied natural gas bound for Japan, grain haulers carrying soybeans from the American Midwest to feed pigs in China. For over a century, this 80-kilometer ribbon of water has been the quiet artery of the modern economy, so essential and so reliable that most of the world simply stopped thinking about it. It was infrastructure in the truest sense, invisible until it breaks. And in the last few years, it has started to break. Here is the secret that most people never learned in school. The Panama Canal is not, and never has been, a simple cut through the land connecting two oceans. Unlike the Suez Canal, which sits at sea level and lets ships glide through on nothing but gravity and salt water, Panama is a staircase. Ships are lifted nearly 90 feet above sea level through a series of massive locks, floated across an enormous artificial lake, and then lowered back down on the other side. That lake, Gatun Lake, is not seawater. It is fresh water, collected from rainfall across the Panamanian Isthmus, and it is the single most important ingredient in the entire operation. Every time a ship passes through a lock, roughly 52 million gallons of that precious fresh water gets flushed out into the ocean, lost forever. Multiply that by the roughly 14,000 vessels that transit the canal each year, and you begin to understand the almost unbelievable scale of water the canal consumes just to keep functioning. For most of its history, this wasn't a problem. Panama is one of the wettest countries on Earth, and the lake replenished itself year after year without much drama, but the climate has changed the rules. In 2023 and into 2024, Panama experienced one of the most severe droughts in its recorded history, a crisis scientists linked directly to a brutal El Niño pattern, colliding with the broader warming of the planet. Rainfall plummeted. Gatun Lake's water levels dropped to historic lows, and the Panama Canal Authority, faced with the very real possibility of running out of water entirely, did something almost unthinkable. It began rationing the canal itself. Daily transits, which once numbered close to 40, were slashed by more than a third. Ships were restricted in how deep they could sit in the water, meaning many had to leave cargo behind just to make the crossing, sacrificing profit for passage. And then came the backlog. At the peak of the crisis, more than 160 vessels were anchored offshore, idling in tropical heat, burning fuel and money while they waited their turn. Waiting in that line could cost a shipping company tens of thousands of dollars a day. So an entire black market of desperation emerged. Shipping companies began participating in canal auctions, essentially bidding wars to skip the line, and the numbers became staggering. One tanker company reportedly paid nearly $4 million in a single auction, just for the privilege of jumping the queue by a matter of days. It was less like paying a toll and more like paying a ransom. The Panama Canal Authority raised its standard tolls too, permanently, arguing it needed the revenue to fund long-term water security. For the shipping industry, an industry that runs on thin margins and tight schedules, this combination of unpredictability and rising cost was a wake-up call. If the canal that the entire world had quietly depended on for over 100 years could simply run out of water, then relying on it exclusively was no longer just inconvenient. It was a strategic risk. Layer on top of that a fresh wave of geopolitical tension, renewed rhetoric out of Washington about the strategic importance and even the ownership of the canal. Concerns from American officials about Chinese-linked companies operating ports at both entrances to the waterway. Panama itself, caught in the middle of a tug-of-war between global superpowers, who both understand exactly what this quarter-mile-wide channel of water is actually worth. Add rising insurance premiums. Add unpredictable weather patterns that meteorologists warn will only become more common, and you have the perfect storm. Suddenly, for the first time in a century, the question being asked in boardrooms from Singapore to Rotterdam to Houston was not, how do we get through Panama faster? It was, do we even need Panama at all? That question has kicked off what can only be described as a modern-day gold rush, a race across an entire continent, backed by tens of billions of dollars in investment, ambitious governments, foreign superpowers, and engineers dreaming up alternatives that range from the pragmatic to the almost fantastical. This is the story of the race to replace the Panama Canal, and it begins, fittingly, just a few hundred miles to the north, in Mexico. Mexico's answer to the crisis isn't a canal at all. It's something the industry calls a dry canal, and it's centered on a narrow strip of land called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where Mexico pinches down to barely 200 kilometers between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. The Mexican government's solution, known as the Interoceanic Corridor, or CIIT, is essentially a bet that you don't need water to move a container from one ocean to another. You just need speed, steel, and coordination. The plan connects the port of Coatzacoalcos on the Gulf side to the port of Salina Cruz on the Pacific side, using a modernized rail line, supported by an upgraded 4-lane highway running in parallel. In theory, a container ship arriving from Asia could dock at Salina Cruz, have its cargo loaded onto trains, and have those containers arrive on the Gulf Coast in about 6 hours, ready to be loaded onto a different ship bound for the United States Gulf Coast or Europe, backed by roughly $7.5 billion in investment. The Mexican government has also built out 10 industrial parks along the corridor, hoping to turn the entire region into a manufacturing hub, not unlike what happened decades ago along the U.S.-Mexico border with maquiladoras. On paper, it's elegant. In practice, it runs headfirst into one of the oldest problems in global logistics: the cost of touching cargo more than once. Every time a container has to be lifted off a ship, placed on a train, and then lifted back onto another ship, that's time, that's money, and that's risk. Shipping analysts call this double handling, and it is precisely the inefficiency the Panama Canal was built to eliminate in the first place, since a ship can simply glide through without ever needing a crane. The Interoceanic Corridor has also faced real bottlenecks getting off the ground: limited port capacity at Salina Cruz, which historically handled far less traffic than a modern trade route demands; security concerns in a region that has struggled with cartel violence; and the sheer logistical challenge of convincing global shipping alliances to reroute decades-old supply chains through an unproven corridor. Trains have started running. Cargo volumes are growing slowly, but as of today, the Interoceanic Corridor moves a tiny fraction of what Panama processes in a single week. It is a genuine contender, but it is also, for now, a work in progress trying to prove itself to a shipping industry that is famously resistant to change. If Mexico is betting on rail and speed, Colombia is dreaming even bigger and running into even bigger problems. For years, Colombian officials and private investors have floated the idea of an interoceanic railway that would connect the Pacific coast near Buenaventura to a Caribbean port, creating a heavy rail-land bridge capable of moving not just containers, but potentially even bulk commodities and eventually oil, in direct competition with the Panama Canal. Some versions of the plan even envision extending toward Venezuela's coastline, positioning Colombia as a critical energy and trade corridor for all of northern South America. The ambition is real. The geography, unfortunately, is brutal. Unlike Mexico's relatively manageable isthmus, The proposed Colombian corridor has to cut through the Darien Gap region and the dense mountainous rainforest of the Choco Department, some of the most biodiverse and least developed terrain on the entire planet. This isn't flat desert scrubland where you can lay track in a straight line. This is a landscape of steep mountain ranges, rivers that flood unpredictably, and rainforests so thick that building any kind of heavy infrastructure requires enormous feats of engineering and enormous environmental cost. Conservationists have raised serious alarms about the ecological damage a heavy rail corridor could inflict on one of the most sensitive ecosystems in the Western Hemisphere, home to countless species found nowhere else on Earth, and to indigenous communities who have lived on this land for centuries. Then there's the money. Estimates for a serious version of this railway run into the tens of billions of dollars, and Colombia, unlike Mexico, does not have a government-backed war chest ready to deploy at that scale. Much of the funding conversation has revolved around foreign investment, and inevitably, that means Chinese capital, which introduces its own layer of geopolitical complexity, given Washington's growing anxiety about Chinese infrastructure investment anywhere near the canal. Add persistent security concerns in parts of Colombia, still affected by armed groups, and you have a project that remains, for now, mostly a line on a map and a slide in an investor pitch deck. It's not dead. Feasibility studies continue, and Colombian officials speak about it with genuine enthusiasm. But among serious logistics analysts, it's widely regarded as the longest shot of the major contenders, a project defined as much by the scale of its ambition as by the scale of its obstacles. Which brings us to the most audacious, most controversial, and frankly most cinematic of all the challengers. Nicaragua's dream of a canal so massive it would make Panama look small by comparison. The idea of a Nicaraguan canal is actually older than the Panama Canal itself. Back in the 19th century, American surveyors seriously considered Nicaragua, not Panama, as the site for the first Interoceanic Canal, thanks to the natural corridor provided by the massive Lake Nicaragua, sitting almost perfectly between the two oceans. That plan lost out to Panama for a mix of engineering and political reasons. But the dream never fully died. It resurfaced in a dramatic way back in 2013, when the Nicaraguan government granted a concession to a Hong Kong-based businessman named Wang Jing to build a canal nearly 3 times the length of Panama's at an eye-watering projected cost of around $50 billion at the time, a figure that ballooned in later estimates to something closer to $64 billion. Unlike Panama's lock system, this was envisioned as a route that could handle the absolute largest ships in the world, vessels too big to fit through even the expanded Panama Canal, cutting straight through Lake Nicaragua itself. The scale of the ambition was almost unbelievable. A project that would have required moving more earth than the construction of the Suez and Panama Canals combined, flooding vast stretches of rainforest, displacing tens of thousands of rural Nicaraguans, and fundamentally altering one of the largest freshwater lakes in the Western Hemisphere. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it collapsed. Wang Jing's personal fortune reportedly evaporated in the 2015 Chinese stock market crash. Ground was broken on some ancillary construction, but the main channel never materialized. Environmental groups sounded alarms about the irreversible damage to Lake Nicaragua's ecosystem and drinking water supply. Farmers and indigenous communities protested the seizure of their land. International financing never fully came together, and the concession became something of an international punchline. A canal that existed mostly in press releases and computer renderings. But here's why you can't fully write it off. The concession legally still exists in some form, tied up in Nicaraguan law. Chinese state interest in Latin American infrastructure has only grown since 2015, not shrunk, as Beijing continues pursuing its Belt and Road ambitions across the region. And every time the Panama Canal faces another crisis, whether it's drought, political friction with Washington, or rising tolls, Nicaraguan officials and Chinese-linked investors quietly float the idea again. It remains by far the biggest wild card on this entire list, probably the least likely to actually get built in the next decade, but also, if it ever did, the single project capable of most directly threatening Panama's dominance, simply because of its sheer scale. Beyond these three headline projects, the region is dotted with smaller ambitions chasing the same prize. Honduras has pursued its own interoceanic logistics corridor, aiming to connect Puerto Cortes on the Caribbean side to Amapala on the Pacific through a mix of highway and rail upgrades, positioning itself as a lower-cost, lower-drama alternative for cargo that doesn't need the largest vessels. Guatemala has floated similar dry canal concepts. Across the region, port authorities are expanding capacity, betting that even if no single project fully replaces Panama, a distributed network of smaller corridors could collectively absorb a meaningful slice of the cargo that used to have no choice but to queue up at the canal's locks. Which brings the story back to Panama itself, because if there's one thing you should never underestimate, it's the Panamanian government's determination to defend the golden goose that has powered its entire national economy for generations. Panama isn't sitting back and watching challengers circle. It's fighting back, and its most ambitious weapon is a massive new piece of infrastructure, the Indio River Reservoir. This roughly $1.6 billion project involves damming the nearby Indio River and constructing a new reservoir connected to the canal system through a tunnel, creating an entirely new freshwater reserve, dedicated to keeping the locks running even in years of severe drought. It's a direct, engineering first response to the exact vulnerability that triggered the 2023 crisis in the first place. Not enough fresh water to keep the system operating at full capacity. Alongside the reservoir, Panama has also invested in water-saving basins at the newer, larger locks completed back in 2016. Basins that recycle a portion of the fresh water used in each transit rather than flushing all of it straight out to sea. It's not a complete fix, and the Indio River project has faced its own local opposition from communities who would be displaced by the new reservoir, but it represents Panama's clearest acknowledgement yet that water, not traffic capacity, is now the single greatest threat to its survival as the world's most important shipping route. Panama has also been quietly building its own version of a dry canal, a rail and port system connecting its Pacific and Caribbean coasts, designed to offer shippers a land bridge alternative even within Panama itself, so that if the canal ever again has to ration transits, cargo still has somewhere to go without leaving the country entirely. It's a fascinating strategic pivot, the birthplace of the Interoceanic Canal, now hedging its own bets, competing against itself in miniature, just to make sure it doesn't lose the broader war for global trade dominance. And then there's the wild card that has nothing to do with Latin America at all, one that comes not from human engineering, but from a warming planet. As Arctic sea ice continues its dramatic long-term retreat, two entirely new shipping routes are becoming, for at least part of the year, genuinely navigable. The Northwest Passage, threading through the islands of northern Canada, and the Northern Sea Route, tracing Russia's Arctic coastline. Both offer something that no lock system or rail corridor ever could: a direct oceanic shortcut between major markets in Asia, Europe, and North America, with the potential to cut thousands of kilometers and, in some cases, over a week of transit time off a traditional voyage through Panama or Suez. Russia has invested heavily in nuclear-powered icebreakers and Arctic port infrastructure specifically to capitalize on this shift, positioning the Northern Sea route as a genuine strategic asset. Shipping companies have already run experimental cargo voyages along both routes during the increasingly long ice-free summer windows. But the Arctic option comes with its own steep costs. Navigation remains treacherous and unpredictable, even as ice retreats. Insurance premiums for Arctic transits are substantially higher. Specialized ice-class vessels are required for much of the year, and the routes remain unusable for large stretches of winter. There are also serious geopolitical complications, particularly around using a Russian-controlled route amid ongoing international sanctions and profound environmental concerns about opening up one of the planet's last untouched ecosystems to heavy commercial shipping traffic. Still, as Arctic ice continues to retreat year after year, most serious maritime analysts now treat these polar routes not as science fiction, but as a slow-motion, long-term disruptor that could reshape global shipping patterns within a generation, with or without a single new canal ever being built. So, where does this leave us? A canal in crisis, defending itself with dams and reservoirs. A dry canal in Mexico proving itself one train car at a time. A railway dream in Colombia, tangled in rainforest and financing gaps. A $64 billion ghost of a canal in Nicaragua that refuses to fully disappear. And a warming Arctic quietly rewriting the map above all of them. What this fragmentation really means is a fundamental shift in how global trade will operate for the rest of this century. For over 100 years, the world enjoyed the convenience of a single, dominant shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, a choke point so reliable that entire global supply chains were built around its predictable rhythm. That era of easy reliance is ending. The future looks less like one great canal and more like a diversified network, ships and cargo owners constantly weighing multiple routes against each other. The traditional lock system in Panama, dry corridors across Mexico and potentially Colombia, Arctic shortcuts during summer months, and possibly, decades from now, an entirely new sea-level canal somewhere in Nicaragua if political and financial stars ever align. For everyday consumers, this fragmentation carries real consequences. More routing options should, in theory, mean more resilience, fewer catastrophic bottlenecks like the one that crippled global trade during the 2023 drought or the earlier Suez blockage of 2021. But it also means more complexity, more infrastructure to build and maintain, and, at least in the short term, higher costs as companies pay a premium to diversify away from total dependence on any single choke point. Geopolitically, every new route becomes a new pressure point, a new place where superpowers compete for influence, port ownership, and strategic leverage, from Chinese investment across Central America to American anxiety about who ultimately controls the gateways to global trade. Will any single challenger actually dethrone the Panama Canal? Almost certainly not. At least not within the next decade. Panama still moves more cargo through its locks in a single month than most of these alternatives move in a year. And the canal's century of institutional expertise, existing infrastructure, and sheer operational scale give it advantages that are extraordinarily difficult to replicate from scratch. But dethroning was never really the right way to frame this race in the first place. The real transformation isn't about which single project wins. It's about the end of Panama's monopoly on the very idea of connecting two oceans. The 21st century's global trade map won't be defined by one great shortcut, but by a patchwork of imperfect alternatives, each filling in the gaps the others cannot cover, each hedging against the very real possibility that the water, the politics, or the climate itself might one day fail the world's oldest superhighway. The age of easy convenience is over. The age of the multimodal, fragmented, endlessly contested global supply chain has already begun, and the $270 billion race to reshape it is only just getting started.